What was your biggest Thanksgiving family drama ever? When sisters attack. I have 3 sisters, all much older, 9, 13, and 15 years older, so they were always far ahead of me in life. They all had families and children etc. well before me. I cannot have children, which they did not know. We were at the Thanksgiving table and things were tense because they were nasty and I was just waiting for an insult. They started in on me about having children and I said my husband and I were in the process of adopting. My oldest sister said, "That is not really having children." I punched her. I don't regret it. Granddad's deep dark secret. I was around 5 to 6 years old. Us kids were playing hide and seek and I hid way in the back of grandma's closet. While I was hiding back there, I found this beautiful deep red robe. I assumed it belonged to my grandfather who died just after I was born. I tried it on and it was huge on me, but the silk felt really smooth and cool, so I decided to go ask my grandma if I could have it to grow into. Turns out Granddad was a grand dragon in the Corral in a KKK, and it was his ceremonial robe. The family members who didn't know about this already were highly upset. The ones who knew were super embarrassed. There was a small riot when I walked into the kitchen wearing it. It was like time froze for a minute, and then people were rushing at me from every direction to bum rush me out of the kitchen. It was probably hilarious if you weren't the one with 3 huge women rushing at you like NFL linebackers. In the end, she wouldn't let me have it, so I asked her to will it to me when she died and she did, but my idiot cousin stole it. I was going to donate it to a civil rights museum in South Carolina, but he wanted it to wear to Klan meetings, and when he found out that he couldn't, he threw it away. As far as I know, he was the last family member that was active in that bull at all. He tried a couple of times to get me into it, but I threatened violence if he ever talked to me about it again and he stopped. While that was an awkward Thanksgiving, I haven't been to a family Thanksgiving in some time. I'm sort of estranged from the family now. As a group they are pretty toxic, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised if the story still gets told. You know how families from the South are with family stories. My family is a Jerry Springer episode. My mom, grandmother, and I had just gotten back from eating at my aunt's house. My mom and I lived with my grandmother along with my uncle. I was the first in the house and heard my uncle in a screaming match with his ex-wife on the phone. I had horrible anxiety as a child, so any loud noise or slightly raised voices made me have a panic attack, so I immediately ran to my mom. By this time, my uncle had unplugged his phone line and his ex was now non-stop calling my grandmother's phone line, making my grandmother anxious to the point of having chest pains. My mom calmly took the phone and told her to not call anymore because she thinks her mother is having a heart attack and she was going to dial 911. My uncle's ex began to laugh, which set my mom off, so she called her a nasty name before hanging up. My uncle apparently heard this or had plugged his phone back in and gotten a call from the ex because he asked my mom to go outside with him to talk. They went on the porch and he said, "I'm glad you came out. I don't want your kid to see what I'm going to do to you." Then he lifted his fist up. Somehow my mom maintained control and simply told him if he hit her, he'd be spending the night in jail. My grandmother came outside with some of his clothes in a trash bag and told him to leave. My family is a Jerry Springer episode. My mom's the youngest of 9. Anyways, he didn't talk to my mom or grandmother for a few years after that, but they eventually made up somehow. He then went on to be a raging pile of crap again a few months ago and now my mom is back to not talking to him. Oh, and plot twist, he's now remarried to the crazy ex-wife. Mom called out the whole family in a truly epic fashion. The year was 2014. I had just graduated high school and my family was crumbling. My parents were not doing well in their marriage and my mom had me drive separately, 5 hours away, so that we would have a second car to leave early with, if we needed it. Red flag #1. Mom did not want to go, but she felt that she should be there, since all of her kids were going. Thanksgiving with my dad's family was not a small gathering. I'm talking 90 to 130 people that rented out space in a church banquet hall to have this gathering. It was a typical West Virginia gathering. Everyone was drinking and talking about church stuff. I don't mind this, I'm just not religious myself, and grandma was about to turn 90 the day after Thanksgiving. So everyone was all over her, and she loves attention. Mom and dad started to argue quietly in the corner about how my narcissistic grandma kept just interjecting herself into everything, and you could just see the tension building between my parents. They were constantly making passive-aggressive comments to each other and to the family members. It was all the drama in the room. My grandma was talking to me about how my siblings and I were doing, then decided that we needed to extend our stay so that we could go to church on Sunday with her because we obviously needed Jesus. My family has always been atheists. She said we were raised poorly and badly behaved because we didn't have church in our lives. All of my siblings or I were between the ages of 14 to 18. All have good grades and were polite, etc. I told my mom what she said to me, and she blew a freaking lid. Red flag #2. She went to dad and told him to tell off his mom, which he refused, and said that she was just trying to help and she thinks Jesus is the answer. She said, and I quote, "The only person who needs Jesus in this room is you, you lying, cheating piece of garbage." Dead silent. The whole room just stopped talking and moving, and that's terrifying when there are that many freaking people. Dad then blew up on mom in front of everyone because she was embarrassing him. Grandma had to sit because she was so stunned. Mom decided to announce to everyone that dad was cheating on her and she was gathering evidence for the divorce. She then decided to point at every single person she hated in the room and describe to them why she hated them. Some examples: Uncle Mike goes after young kids and everyone knows it, but nobody does anything about it. He was known to be a little too friendly with the kids. Karen and Joe are first cousins and they are married. What the heck? This was true. They even had the same last name. She turned to grandma and said, "You're the most bitter old witch of this entire bunch. I can only hope your pathetic self doesn't make it to 90. Her 90th birthday was literally the next day. There were more, but once she was done screaming at the family, she opened the door and yelled, "I cannot wait to be rid of this crappy West Virginia church crap." Needless to say, I went and got my mom, and then left with her and my siblings very shortly after that, and I haven't seen that side of the family since. Parents are since divorced, and my mom is now happily remarried to a wonderful man. She later told me that my dad was having an affair with his best friend's wife, who was also my brother's best friend's mother. How low must you sink to destroy a child's relationship with his best friend from kindergarten? He was also stealing her jewelry and giving it to this woman. All of this played into her explosion. I was right. She had not wished to go to the family gathering, but feared us kids would be accosted by everyone feeling bad for them as my dad had told so many lies. My dad, well, just desserts, karma or whatever else you might call it, has bounced from woman to woman and is in a lawsuit over money with one of them. One passed away from an illness, and as he was crying at a hospital bedside, for onlookers, he was texting another woman he was cheating with. And that's why that Thanksgivings lives on as one of the most treasured memories of my childhood. How one terrible Thanksgiving tore their family apart for over a decade. My niece was dating this crapstin of a person. He was a con man and a liar. He was in his late 30s dating a girl in her early 20s. He already had 3 kids with one on the way. A real piece of work. He was teaching his sons to be misogynistic woman-hating jerks. He denied his daughter was his, even though she looked exactly like him and drag. My sister and this guy got into an argument on Thanksgiving, with him basically calling her genetic trash, and they started yelling at each other. My brother, my niece's father, had the tryptophan haze going on, and woke up to the yelling. He went to kick this jerk out permanently. In his rush, he knocked over our mother who had just had rotator cuff surgery. I fought my brother to stop him, not to save the jerk's life, but to preserve my brother's. The crapstin and my niece left. I told everyone, "Get out of my way, I'm getting my coat." I grabbed my sister and we left. The police were called but everyone had gone by the time they showed up. This started a family fight that lasted almost 10 years. My niece started telling lies about my sister. My brother and sister stopped talking. Then the jerk exposed himself to my nephew's daughter. My niece finally realized this guy was not worth the value of the raw materials he was made of, and had him legally written out of the picture. She finally apologized for spreading lies. It was just last year with my dad almost dying that my brother and sister started talking again. After 14 years, you know what my parents remember? Me saying the F word in my brother's house. Way to keep your eye on the ball. The jerk died in September. We can't figure out if someone did it to him or he did it himself. Either way, the world is better off and this will be a happier Thanksgiving for his absence. How a sisterly rivalry ruined Thanksgiving. Holidays were spent at Granddad's house. One year we were inside watching some corny bet Thanksgiving movie when we heard a crash and screaming. We all look/go outside to see my two female cousins, who were sisters, fighting on the ground while this sleazy guy from the neighborhood was standing over them, laughing. Turns out they were both dating him and they didn't know it until that day. The biggest tragedy was that the cause of the crash was the grill toppling over. We were smoking a ham on it. I was ticked. So that's what kissing cousins are. When my husband was about 14, he went to Thanksgiving with his mom's side of the family in West Virginia. They're exactly the bad stereotypes you've heard about people in West Virginia. His cousins had been getting increasingly creepy about him and his older siblings for years, but this trip culminated in two female cousins about his age snuck up on him when they thought he was sleeping and tried dancing on him. He slept in the back of his dad's van that night. It was the last time the family saw those relatives. Nothing brings the family together like tragedy. Last Thanksgiving was absolutely the worst. My extended family live in another state, so it was just me and my parents. My mom was mad at my stepdad for various reasons, so she stayed in her room all day. My stepdad and I awkwardly ate in silence while watching The Godfather. Then after dinner, he had a heart attack. He died in the hospital a few days later. My mom was crushed that he was gone and at how she treated him in their last few days together. That was last year. I'm not excited to see what this year brings. Great-grandma couldn't last one more Thanksgiving. My great-grandmother died at the table right as we were bowing our heads to pray on Thanksgiving. She had been slowly dwindling in health, so the whole family gathered together figuring it was her last Thanksgiving. Little did we know how right we were. Her kids, grandkids, great-grandkids and family she hasn't seen in years were all there, about 20 people in all. Once it was time for dinner, we gathered around the table with her pushed up in her recliner. Food was loaded on the table, and we bowed our heads to pray. She was devoutly religious before we dug in. As we raised our heads and opened our eyes, we found great-grandma slumped over, tongue lolling out, dead. As someone started compressions, she was a register home nurse, and another person called an ambulance. My youngest cousin dug into her meal completely unaffected by the dead body. This was about 5 to 10 years ago now, so the shock has worn off and there was no lasting trauma to anyone. I think my aunt put it best by saying that we fulfilled her last wish by having all of her family gathered together, and she was able to go somewhat peacefully. In fact, looking back, it's all a bit humorous. A couple years back, we had a bunch of extended family over for Thanksgiving. We usually did it at my grandma's house, and this was the first time my mom had to do it on her own. My older brother arrived a couple hours before we ate. He was already pretty drunk, and he kept at it, drinking wine, beer, and whatever he could find. He started saying some inappropriate stuff to my cousin's boyfriend, and when my mom overheard him, she flipped. They had a screaming match for 10 minutes outside the house, while we all tried to ignore it, and she kicked him out. I stared down at my plate while eating, and went right to bed. My older sister struggled with anorexia and bulimia as a teenager. For about 2 years, before she went into treatment, she was very thin, and looked on the verge of death, because she literally was. Thankfully, she got into a good program, gained back a healthy amount of weight, and was on the road to recovery. That year, my dad's sister invited us to Thanksgiving at their place. My dad and his sister hadn't been close since she got married because he didn't like or trust her husband, who I'll call Joe. He tried to warn her before the wedding that Joe was a generally shitty person, but my aunt married him anyway. We show up on Thanksgiving Day, and my aunt has been cooking and cleaning her butt off while Uncle Joe downed beer after beer on the couch. He was really drunk by the time dinner rolled around, and generally being the douchebag my dad warned us he would be. But the real kicker came at dessert. When it came time to cut the pumpkin pie my aunt had made from scratch, he insisted on doing it himself. He stood up and dumped half the beautiful pie onto a plate, looked at my sister and said, "This piece big enough for ya, chubby?" My poor sister, who was just starting to feel okay about eating in front of other people, burst into tears and ran out of the room. My dad erupted, grabbed the plate of pie, and threw it against the wall. It took me, my mom and my aunt to stop him from beating Joe, who thought the whole thing was hilarious and kept drunkenly yelling "Where'd ya go, chubby?" after my sister. Needless to say we left immediately, and my dad told my aunt that if she ever wanted to see us again she would need to get a divorce. It took a few years, but now she's happily engaged to someone else. My sister works for a non-profit that helps promote healthy body image in little girls, and old Uncle Joe is in jail for repeated drunk driving. Karma is real. My mother had very thoughtfully prepared and stuffed a raw turkey for Thanksgiving Day dinner, which I was hosting the next day. She put it in a roasting pan in the back of my van, where I stored it in the cold while I worked that night. As I was rounding the corner on my way to my brother's house after work, I heard a commotion. The back doors on my old van had a habit of flying open at any given moment, and I thought the rustling nothing more than a Jetaway coffee can. When I got to my brother's, who was going with me to see a local band, I got in his car and we drove to the lounge. That the rustling was the turkey didn't dawn on me until mid-show, when I said to my brother, "Rick, we've got to go now." Sure enough, there the turkey was laying in the middle of the sidewalk. Unable to afford another if we could even find one the night before Thanksgiving, we picked it up, took it home, washed it off, and baked it up the next day. All throughout dinner, we would glance at each other knowingly and say "HM, I don't even taste any gravel, do you? A Thanksgiving to remember."